listening to the INL Podcast with Graeme Bradshaw and Philip Watkins, brought to you by Integrated Nutraceuticals Limited, Hong Kong. We're grateful to have you with us. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hi there, Philip Watkins, Naturopath and Director of Education here at INL. I'd like to welcome you to another episode of the INL Podcast. In this episode, I'm joined by INL's and IMI's founder, Graeme Bradshaw. With over 32 years in practice, Graeme is an experienced and respected naturopath, homeopath, medical herbalist and nutritionist. He applies his wealth of clinical experience, knowledge and extensive postgraduate training in diagnostics and functional medicine to treat the root cause for a vast array of health concerns. In this episode, we are talking all things immunity and delving into the deeper principles of natural medicine when it comes to strengthening your immunity. Before we get started, Graeme and I both agreed on wanting to preface this episode with a few key points. Immunity and its strength is determined by a number of individualistic factors and is maintained in large part by the quality of your diet, sleep, and activity levels. The use of nutritional, herbal, and natural medicine-oriented formulas and their success is built largely upon the foundation of these factors. Further, the information presented in this episode is not to be used as prescriptive or diagnostic advice, and if you are experiencing symptoms associated with COVID-19 at this time, we recommend you seek the advice and care of a qualified health professional and conduct yourself correctly to keep yourself and everyone around you as safe as possible. Graeme and I had a great time recording this podcast, and we hope you enjoy it too. Let's get to the interview. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Who knows what day it is at the moment? It's coronavirus time. Welcome to the INL Podcast, episode 10, I believe. And myself, Philip Watkins, Director of Education at INL, and I'm lucky enough to be joined today by our founder, Graeme Bradshaw. Hello.
How you doing?
It's good to have you here. Today we are going to be talking about the hot topic of 2020, it seems, and that topic is immunity. As we touched on in the introduction, this is a very rapidly changing landscape. So today in this episode, we're going to be talking a little broadly about some of the tools and ways of application within natural medicine that we can help people's immunity, and that is through different considerations of the immune system itself. So adaptive immunity and also innate immunity as well. Why the gut's important. So we're going to probably touch on probiotics a little bit there as well, and anything else we can talk about. I'm gonna pick your brains today, Graeme.
Great.
So
well, it's a bit of a dialogue too, because you're quite a fiend with both herbs and probiotics. So yeah, so let's make it a good conversation. Yeah.
I guess my first question, starting off with this, I mean, you consume a lot of journals and a lot of studies, and your ability to interpret the important considerations when it comes to both how we're looking at immunity has really just been amazing over these last few months. How have you kind of taken to interpreting this kind of dam of information that just seems constantly to getting built bigger and bigger and bigger as we go through each day?
Yeah, kind of big question there, and I'm not really sure how to tackle an answer, because it is such a big way of putting it. I mean, as I think we were saying in the prelude to the talk, obviously there's a lot of things that we do in our lifestyle that makes a huge difference to whether we're going to fall sick or not. And probably the biggest single one is whether we are tired and not sleeping well, and has a huge factor. Of course, everybody's now so much more aware of the hygiene component of looking after our health. Not many people are very aware of some dietary factors that have a big impact, like the level of the proteins in your diet. If you're down about 25% on your protein levels in your diet, that has quite a major impact on your immune functions. That's come out of animal studies, but I'm sure of it being just as appropriate for human studies. And when we go through the dietary analysis of our clients, we always, very frequently find, particularly vegetarians and of course many women as well, tend to steer away from concentrated protein sources like meats. And when you do the calculation, they're 20, 30 grams short of protein quite frequently. So if folks are on that diet of a bun in the morning and a bit of noodles at lunch, which is practically every Hong Kong girl, they're going to be 20, 30 grams short of protein in a day when you add it up, and that's having impact on immunity for sure. But then, of course, we come over to the nutrients, and I guess one of the things that is kind of themes in the talk here is what's good for prevention, minimising the chances of getting a virus in general, and let's keep it to a virus in general because there's not enough specific COVID research in that sense. But plenty of studies have been done on reducing the frequencies of upper respiratory tract infections, or even generally respiratory tract infections. And I'll put a couple of slants in towards the elderly because obviously here that gets to be more important. So if you had a couple of studies that say, well, that reduces the incidence of pneumonia in the elderly, well, that kind of becomes a more important finding because the old folks at home are who we really mostly need to protect, and getting nutrient levels up early on in the process is really vital. Things like vitamin D and zinc, for instance, they both take a good while to come up to satisfactory blood levels if you start a supplement. And my golly, who's short of vitamin D is like every elderly patient we've seen is way down there, and any level under 20 nanograms per milliliter, that I'm using that number system when I talk about it. So let's just use the numbers 20 rather than have to go through the units each time. It's almost universal here that people in Hong Kong have numbers in the teens. So the average over the full year of Hong Kong, and this is for young adults actually, is around 13 units. And that's definitely going to produce an immune insufficiency. Older people, that's the case. And we know from a few studies in the past with pneumonia, the elderly have a much higher incidence. There was one showing that if their levels are under 20 nanograms per mil, their incidence of community-acquired pneumonia was 3.7 times greater.
Wow.
So it's a really big factor for the elderly. And mind you, that's only relating to bacterial pneumonia, as in that's the usual type, rather this viral pneumonia that we're talking about this time. But it gives an indication of how significant vitamin D is for keeping people healthy in the lungs. And when it comes to just prevention of regular upper respiratory tract infections, vitamin D stands up very well. And we know from a lot of studies, the lower your level, the more likely you'll get a upper respiratory tract infection too. And these are, usually viruses, as we know. So vitamin D can protect you from picking up or having a severe symptom from viruses. I think that's a fair comment to make.
It's fascinating, isn't it, that it seems that with the kind of broad demand for more information in relation to how to boost your immune system, that I think we often go to more sophisticated ways of looking into how to do that. But really, you've touched on two really big points, one of which we touched on in the intro, but also the fact that covering some of the basics, but also revealing the cracks in some public health issues in that people don't eat enough or they don't get enough nutrient exposure in the first place. Then you add an age demographic that's classically not going to get that as on top of that. Then you look at the vitamin D deficiency simply through what seems to be more of a lifestyle oriented.
Old folks tend to stay indoors more than younger folks, so they're going to have lower vitamin D. It actually
makes the solution to a lot of these things, or at least the foundational solutions, pretty basic.
Well, it would be interesting, in post-mortem studies to see how the level of vitamin D, for instance, relates to the frequency of those who pass away. And just as important in relation to elderly folks getting worse lung infections is zinc. Zinc's peculiar. There's a sort of common phenomenon that happens in 60 and older folks, is their zinc levels when you do it as a serum zinc, it drops quite considerably. And so it's a known common deficiency, and the outcome of well-being later in life is quite closely related to your zinc level. Mortality is quite closely related to your zinc levels. And now I'm talking generally, but if we go into a specific couple of studies, I saw one was 2007, another 2010, both done in elderly populations in US nursing homes, that kind of situation. And one was involving giving folks a supplement of half the recommended daily allowance of all the nutrients and monitoring what happened. And the other was just measuring whether folks had a zinc deficiency. And in both studies, basically, you could say the statement, those who have a zinc insufficiency are twice as prone to getting pneumonia.
Wow.
So it's a very significant nutrient for fighting back infections. It's if you're younger and you're eating some proteins, it actually happens to be highly associated with what's got a protein content, zinc, because in our physical activity of what it's doing in the body, it's got a lot to do with the amino acids, and that's where you find it in proteins. And it's one of the reasons why vegetarians tend to be a bit short. You probably know that the zinc in say the vegetarian sources like lentils, legumes, garbanzos, which look pretty good on paper, actually the zinc just passes right out the back end because it's bound up with a fibre that won't let it go. So I'm often recommending pumpkin seeds to those folks.
Yeah, it's a good move. Yeah.
It seems to do. I've seen actually a patient really have their zinc levels come up from just eating the zinc, from so I should say just eating the pumpkin seeds and getting the zinc that way. Yeah.
It's nice to start this way, I think, because I feel like the focus has been very much on, what can I take, what can I take, what can I take, and it's like, well, wait a minute, what if we're using this whole situation globally? I think I saw that it was like 20 to 25% of the global population are on lockdown right now, and that to me suggests that this is a great reality check. And I think one of the key elements to this conversation in general, and why the pumpkin seed example is such a great illustration of this reality check, is that everyone's very concerned about their health, and rightly so, but there are behaviours, lifestyle and other elements to how you conduct your life on a daily basis that genuinely, as you've touched on, really do increase your risk of getting things in general, aside from some of the more sinister things that are going on in the world at the moment. How about we just say, okay, well, I'm just not eating well enough.
Yeah, right? Or sleeping well enough.
And all of these different things, and I think
particularly when now we're not socialising so much, is like that's normally a plus for our immunity, obviously, depending on what you're up to with your socialising. But now that's cut back so much. It does count to keep your social connections through your social media. It's kind of like still counts as a plus.
It's important.
And of course, how do you manage all of those stresses that might be coming up by confined quarters? That's a one. Do you have more opportunities to sneak out and get the effects of nature, and go have a greenbelt moment, and get a reboost from the way that nature works, to give us a bit of general support from stress.
My next question is that we've been looking, obviously, let me start that again. I've personally been revisiting all of my old textbooks. I feel like it's a great opportunity to try and relearn the immune system, and relearn the opportunities that we have within natural medicine. Especially we touched on the herbs, and we touched on micronutrient supplementation and stuff like that. One of the key things that I think I'd forgotten and I wanted to bring up with you was the old philosophy of natural medicine, and why people can sometimes get confused in relation to the application of some of these things. Before we get into some of the specifics, now, herbal medicine or natural medicine in relation to the immunity was often looked at as either a preventative measure, an acute measure, or a convalescence-based measure. Can you comment on that a little bit in relation to how we should be looking at immunity, and how we should be assessing potential ways to assess the application of these things for our patients, even in general.
Yeah, I think, Phil, any discussion we have about specifically COVID or infections in general, there's this sort of prevention treatment of an acute stage, and it may sneak over into a secondary kind of a stage in that, and then restoration and convalescence and bringing people back. And often we do find with viruses there's that post-viral type of fatigue that you have to restore, and that's a whole really interesting topic of what's going on from viruses, how have they damaged our cells, what is it about the mitochondria that makes them susceptible, the little energy powerhouses. Just as a principle, and probably actually nicely answers your question in a broad sense, mitochondria, thousands in every cell, produce energy and maybe an abundance of energy, that feels like vitality, or get knocked out by a toxin, or in this case a virus. And a lot of them aren't producing the energy under the destructive influence of whatever it is. And then the vitality goes so low that there's only just enough energy to function, so that you don't have that vitality. And without vitality, the cells can't repair themselves and get stuck, which is why quite often you find post-viral syndromes become chronic. There isn't enough energy left over in the mitochondria to do the repair work, to bounce back. And, that natural medicine does. I really love this particular topic, Bill, because I've been bothering everybody here at IMI with bits and pieces of it for a while. But, it'll be something that those who suffer from this virus often will need, is that support post-virally. And we could come onto that maybe another topic at some time, and just talk about the whole, how do you repair the mitochondria? So that's an interesting one. Let me just knock that bell off.
I think there are now a few really key components now. You've brought up the mitochondrial element as well. I think one of the things I wanted to bring up today was actually the role of the digestive system in immunity.
Yeah, and back to the prevention is a great place to start, because so much of our immunity is caught up with what's going on in our gut.
Well, it is, and I think a lot of people don't know that 70% of our immune cells are created in the digestion, and that's a huge proportion.
Yeah.
And the gut-associated lymphatic tissue, which is often forgotten about, but a huge part of natural medicine teaching, as far as how you learn about the conversation between the gut and the immune system. If T regulatory cells can't travel via the lymph, they can't get anywhere. They can't actually go to where they need to go. And the digestion and that kind of multifaceted, multi-system relationship is so important that we then can kind of miss out by saying, okay, well, we're just going to focus on one herb, one nutrient, one thing, when we really may need to say, okay, are there strategies where we can use multiple ingredients that help with different sites of the immune system? And one of those things, and I'm leading somewhere, one of those things is probiotics.
Yeah, it's a biggie, isn't it? And then you come down to the supplement of probiotics, or getting some fermented foods into your diet, and the whole big thing about, well, what are the foods that feed the probiotics? So what is a healthy diet that makes us double up, let's say, on the amount of good healthy flora we have in our gut? And one of the sort of preamble observations on this one is that native folks, let's say, on the periphery of Western civilization, tend to have around about 60% more flora, and in terms of number and diversity in their guts. Like the wild diet creates more gut flora.
Do you think that's an exposure to antibiotics?
It's got something to do with it, and we are drinking chlorinated water, and there's people who like the artificial sweeteners. Many of them have a devastating effect on the good levels of gut flora. So lots of little things that seem to add up to it. And then there's the overly refined diet, and that changes the flora enormously, favouring things we don't like. And you've mentioned something else there, the whole weed killer.
That's nuts.
The Roundup that changes the flora balance quite significantly to things like Clostridium and nasty guys. So things that are, you go have a look at guts now, and it's like, oh, what's the Clostridia doing in there? Like, that's a really rare nothing. No, it's turning up. You know, and you go measure somebody's glyphosate level, it's like, oh, this person got high glyphosate, and we know how that works. Yeah, it's a big change that we're going through in our environmental challenges. But coming around to the probiotic thing, I mean, Cochrane studies are pretty definite about this one, and there's I think about 11 studies that they've included, or is it 12? But kind of number of random controlled trials on probiotics, and they come back with a statement. Now, to say probiotics is to already say something that's like
a pretty
we know clinically like there's a massive range of what people are taking. But so that aside, around a 47% reduction in respiratory tract infections for those who are taking probiotics. So that's actually, from what I can find in research, probiotics come out number one as the preventive agent, and number two is the vitamin D. Actually, people like to talk about vitamin C, and it's sort of flipping already from the probiotic topic, but just to say it in that context, it's way down, like at about maybe 20% of reduction in respiratory tract infection. So it's like not the first thing to go for, excepting if you're way stressed. And I guess, you might have had, I've certainly had the experience of, flying to the States, and you find your clock's right off, and you've got to attend a conference, and you sort of start to get a sore hot throat somewhere in the process, and it's like, oh, and then the nose starts dribbling, and you kind of know where you're going. But getting onto the high, it's always easy to get some vitamin C, so bang, and always works in that high stress kind of situation but then you have to get up around 4 and 6 grams to do the job. And during an infection, as you probably know, those kind of doses reduce the severity and the duration and tend to prevent, going to the bacterial stage in a regular, seasonal cold. But coming back to the probiotics, the whole high fibre diet, keeping up with plenty of veggies. We know a lot of those high FODMAP veggies are actually beneficial so long as you're feeding the right guys, and so it all depends on who you have living inside as to whether those FODMAP foods, the ones that ferment, are going to create a problem or not.
The interesting thing about probiotics, I think, is for me that 2015's Cochrane review has actually been reproduced in a sense with other meta-analyses and systematic reviews, with especially in children as well. I think there was one a year later that kind of following up on that a little bit, and they actually had a really interesting exclusions element to what they were looking at, where they actually excluded any formulas that had prebiotics, vitamins, or any other extraneous agents in there, so they could literally just look at single strain and formulaic based probiotic formulas. And that was with almost double the amount of kids, and that was with just over 6,000. And they said that it was still looking to be a feasible way of reducing respiratory tract infections as well. So
and duration and intensity.
Right.
So one of those things that definitely helps. And then there's which strains. And so if you are sort of selecting a product, whether as a professional or as an individual, you're looking for Lactobacillus rhamnosus, often goes by the short name of Lactobacillus GG. And then there's Casei, Paracasei. They're the ones that I look forward to looking for immunity. There are 2 or 3 others and a couple of the bifidobacteria, but those first ones mentioned are, definitely, you go look in the NIH reference to immunity, and it's like that's the one that they're quoting over and over, those 3 strains. So you're pretty safe. If you're getting up into a 10 billion range for adults and beyond, you don't really ever need to go over 50 billion, kind of in definitely 10 billion and maybe 20 billion if you are needing a bit more on a daily basis. That'll definitely give you these kind of good results.
That's great.
Yeah.
And the key thing here, I think, is that I've actually always been clinically obsessed with single strain, just more for, I guess, what you would call evidence-based stuff. So rhamnosus for eczema, plantarum for inflammatory conditions, IBD.
And just to interrupt for a sec, Reuteri for the kids, immunity is super well researched. Number of days off with fevers in a year is halved, number of days off school is halved. and duration of illness is reduced as well. It's Reuteri for kids is one of the ones to look out for. Yeah,
it does seem like the Lactobacillus team is the the way forward. The team of players.
Yeah.
But I guess I was going to touch on it. I actually had my opinion changed a couple of years ago, in that I found a really interesting European study that compared the efficacy of single strain versus multi-strain probiotics across the board. And in all cases, even if you were looking at having a very clear symptom-specific outcome, so hay fever or things like that, you would still get a better result when they all came in together, which was super interesting, because it's funny when you're interpreting the studies, you'll see LGG often on its own, you'll see maybe Paracasei or other things on its own, but I think it's really important that the broader sense does seem that using them in a multi-strain is a better way to go.
And they all have a little bit of a tweak here and there, and I think what we're talking about in a broad sense here is the immune modulation.
Yeah.
So that the probiotics like vitamin D both help the T-reg cells, both help push things towards the T1 side, which is the more active half of our immunity, rather than fooling around with the allergy and autoimmunity, getting on with the job of what it's really designed for, mainly, let's say. But, we're going to need to mention the cytokines somewhere in here, because of the terminology of a cytokine storm that comes along with this particular virus, COVID-19. And one of the ways that both vitamin D and the probiotics work is to reduce the cytokine, particularly IL-6, TNF alpha, NF kappa B. These are the big trio that are a problem. And most probiotics do the opposite. If they boost up the interleukin 10 and sometimes some of the other of the beneficial cytokines. So that's immune regulating. So you might need other substances at times when somebody's got a kind of a dead immune system, like Astragalus or reishi, and these kind of deep acting immune herbs for people like really conked out, and they do stimulate cytokines, so they can mount an immune response. But in this particular case, I advise people not to do Astragalus or reishi, because come the day that they may have this virus, the last thing you want is an overactive immune system that's going to overly fire up and maybe go down into the hospitalization stage of this COVID problem.
I want to just highlight a small point that you've just made there that I really want to, I guess, as a clinician speaking to maybe people who are interested or they're looking to take some personal sovereignty in relation to what they're doing. The Astragalus and reishi example is a really clear example of where herbal medicine is misrepresented in relation to its role in immunity, in that we were talking to Gianna, who's our TCM doctor here, and the Chinese always used to say that Astragalus during an acute infection is like having a robber in the house and locking all the doors and windows, in that you'll get the immune effect, but it's not the immune effect that you're looking for. And this is a really, really big common thing.
Yeah, it's really obvious when you look at the cytokine effect of Astragalus, that once you've got the infection and you're starting to cook, it's getting hot and there's some fever in your system, those cytokines are already going, and you don't want something that's going to stoke the fire. It's like throwing a bit more fuel in there. And both reishi and Astragalus, good examples of herbs not to use. And then there's some other immune-related herbs, and they're relevant here in this discussion. And one of them's some of the Echinacea species. We all know good for infection, but are they? We've got to ask that question now in relation to the cytokine issue. So maybe just we step back for those listeners who are not professional. We started talking about cytokines and we started saying these weird things like TNF alpha and blah blah blah. Cytokines are one of the chemicals. You could think of them a bit like hormones within the immune system, and some of them are pro-inflammatory, and that can be stimulating and necessary to activate an immune response. Yeah, so we need it. So, at the beginning of I've got a twisted knee at the moment. It's really bothering me. It's just one of those things. But I had to let it have a day or so of getting inflamed, because if I put on too much of an anti-inflammatory at the beginning, the healing response is going to be impaired, and we actually know that from medical advice not to start your anti-inflammatory, NSAIDs sort of things too early, because otherwise you slow down repair. So there is this necessary activation stage, but once it's going, you don't want to be cooking by throwing on more fuel to the fire. And coming back to Echinacea for a minute, Echinacea purpura, one of the two species, is able to quench the inflammatory cytokines, which makes it a pretty cool herb in this regard. Yeah.
Preaching to the choir with me there, and Echinacea. But Echinacea is a great example as well of kind of one of those herbs that comes up a lot in the media when negative research comes out. And they say Echinacea doesn't really do much for cold. Well, it never's supposed to be. It was always meant to modulate the lymphatic system. It was always meant to have an effect on the endocannabinoid system that actually primed the immunity, or as you said, it modulated the immune system between infections, so that you actually didn't get one, or your ability to be more resilient would be improved. And I think that's another example, isn't it? Because I remember you were mentioning yesterday with Echinacea that there can actually be some mucous membrane issues, as far as I remember. Correct me if I'm wrong. We covered a lot of
part of
things
the way
in
that
that
I think what you're getting to is that how COVID actually damages the alveolar lining.
Yeah,
so first
right,
the cilia start falling off, and then next the cells themselves, and so you've got a pretty leaky lung, and in response to all of that damage, it starts filling up with the debris and fluids that come with that. And I mean, this is not to say that Echinacea is going to do a heap in that kind of situation.
Just go back to the disclaimer at the beginning. Just remember.
But should a patient come to me, after they've been through any hospitalisation, for this Echinacea would be one of the herbs in there to help, as you called it, the lymphatic. It's a phagocytosis. It's a gobbling up of debris that the Echinacea herbs do produce. So that's one of their features. We often use it when people come in with lymphatic swellings and things like that, because it helps to just tidy up what's left over after infections very well.
So essentially good for prevention potentially, but maybe better for convalescence.
Yeah, I think so. I don't see it as a very good prevention herb, and there isn't good research good research to show it stops upper respiratory tract infections. There's a bit, but it's one of those herbs that depends a lot on the dosage given to people. It's kind of like, if I'm falling sick and I want some Echinacea, I'm like taking 15 mils and like getting a bit of a jolt through my system, and then all of a sudden things start happening. It's like, oh, I feel that, so it is a bit of a dose dependent herb, that one.
It is.
Yeah.
But look, let's talk a little bit more on some of the broader elements of what we've been looking at. You've touched on zinc, you've touched on vitamin C a little bit there. Are there any other considerations or anything that's come across your mind at all?
I think just to move the conversation towards somewhere after there is some sort of sign of symptoms with this. So let's say it might be day 3 or day 7, depends on how long somebody takes till they activate a fever response. So we've got then something like a week normally. Let's say it's from day 2 till about day 9 before they're either getting well or going to hospital. So there's a stage there when, let's say, I think what I've got to do at this point in conversation is not pretend that many of those patients are coming to any of us much and they're worrying themselves sick at home. But let's say for ourselves, we'd like to have something in our medicine kit.
Of course.
And for our friends, and it may not be that we get to treat that many patients in this particular case. I mean, normally we do have patients coming in with the kind of symptoms that are to do with fever and a dry, irritating cough of bronchitis. It's a pretty common presentation through winter. Oddly enough, we don't see it much this year. I mean, actually, the hidden number of people who haven't died to do with influenza, I'd say in Hong Kong at the moment, it's about 150 people haven't died from influenza this year.
I was going to say, they said that the flu season's been shortened to 3 weeks or something like that.
Yeah, I saw, it kicked off with news of 7 people dying in the second week of January, and then we started wearing masks, and it's like it stopped.
Unbelievable.
There was one unfortunate little child died a bit later than that, but I mean, basically one thing that has been affected by our good hygiene now as the influenza. And so we're not seeing much upper respiratory tract infection issue in our clinics. But so let's come around to a treatment. Astragalus. Good old Astragalus. It's an Indian herb. It's a Chinese herb. It's got enough use to have had 30 random control studies done on it.
So good.
And basically it cuts the duration of a cold, the intensity of a cold. I mean, both you and I, Phil, could probably talk about the times we've started on our Astragalus, and it's like that hot, sore, irritating thing that's starting up. It's like bang within a few hours normally, and certainly, if you get into the high doses, it really deals with that very well for us.
It does.
So, and there are a couple of specific things about Astragalus and this infection. It does affect how the virus binds onto the ACE, the ACE receptors in the lungs. That's something we could expand on. There's a few other herbs do that are interesting at the moment, but this one does. But on the cytokines side, it has a huge effect on reducing the inflammatory storm, does Astragalus. That's why it's quite a cooling kind of herb, anti-inflammatory type of herb. And it's a very effective one for that.
It's kind of interesting in that Astragalus kind of just started off as a digestive herb, right? The king of the bitters.
Ooh.
And
it's bitter, right?
It was, and I think over the last 10 years, it's become so much more than. I mean, I was taught, and this was, I like to say it was long enough ago, but not that long ago, that Astragalus was a big digestive herb. And you had an old cold digestion. Then you would often think of the most bitter herb you could ever give someone. It was either gentian or Astragalus. And
if you're going mildly golden seal, like all of them, pretty tough to take. Yeah, in liquid tinctures, most people just won't.
I'd apologise to my patients who saw me in the first 6 to 8 years of my practice because I relentlessly gave them all Astragalus.
I'm afraid I'm still a bit of a demon on that. I kind of do the little giggle and
it just works, right? It just works. And you know what I would do? I would have a shot with them. Just so just to say, hey, I'm with you. But
it's like every morning having that shudder, like there's a particular bitter herbal shudder that you have.
I think though you brought up a great point that it does work. Astragalus is as effective as it looks.
If you look for Astragalus and respiratory tract infections as a quick Google search, you'll find there's a decent study. Like many studies, it's a study of studies. It's a meta study, and of course they put the last thing about they could be better controlled studies and this and that and the other. But the statistics in there are really solid statistics of an effective medicine for acute respiratory tract infections. And so think of it not so much when things are up in the head, in the very early stages of a cold, but more once it's coming down into the bronchi and there's that hot, irritating kind of cough that we hearing is the type of cough that people do get with COVID-19. It's a perfect herbal prescription for that. And some of the combinations, we obviously we represent a company here at INL, but there are combinations like Armourforce or the MediHerb one, Astragalus, that are also combine it with a couple of other herbs and accentuate those beneficial effects. So there are products that you don't have to take the dreaded tinctures, and you can eat the pills and a couple of pills 3 times a day. It's easy, So it's good to have, and for those of you who are practitioners and do access our products, do look out for the Armourforce or the MediHerb Astragalus product, because you want to have some of those at least for yourself at home if you're not yet used to using herbs for your patients.
Yeah, it's a great addition to I think any medicine cabinet.
It is.
Yeah. There are I think every day I see a new novel treatment for something, and if it's along the lines of COVID-19, it's just. I'm starting to hear now melatonin, I'm starting to hear quercetin. How do we kind of sift through all this chaos and sift through all of this and actually say, right, what if I was just to put it on you today without any warning, which I'm doing, what should we really be concentrating on?
I can probably tell you what am I doing.
Go for it. That's perfect.
Educated, what can you say? Not quite guess, but process. So my vitamin D levels are good in my blood. I know that my zinc levels needed support about 4 months ago. Like most 60-year-olds, I'm starting to have a bit of a struggle keeping the zinc up, and I've been doing that the last few months, and it's up over what it needs to be, up in 80, whatever the units are, I don't recall them. Then probiotics is always part of my routine. I like to keep a healthy digestion. So that preventive stuff I've been taking now since the virus has been around, elderberry. Elderberry because, well, it's always been known to help with winter viral infections. It binds the flu viruses of all type and some of the others too. And it turns out that it actually locks on to the ACE2 receptor where the COVID virus enters the lungs, and it looks as if it would be very useful in that regard. And there's a couple of other hints that it's useful in the preventive stage. I probably wouldn't rely on it for treatment, probably continue it, but if I were falling sick, I would be getting into the armour force straight away. I probably wouldn't be bothering about melatonin. There is a theoretical way that it drops the inflammatory inflammasome. There's a particular substance in there, and it may help. And particularly if you're older and your melatonin levels are super low, it might help. But frankly, it wouldn't be something I'd necessarily use for myself or for others. But I certainly would use Astragalus. And then during any active infection, I'd be into the very high dose vitamin C and use quercetin with it. So quercetin, very high dose. I mean, we're hearing some reports of intravenous vitamin C being used in Shanghai and some reports of in New York City now have emerged. Really? Yeah, just hearing it on the internet. But nobody's got out to the published result stage. But we do know that high dose vitamin C knocks a lot of viruses out, and it's often used for people struggling to get rid of their glandular fever, as an example. And we know the mechanism of action. It's an effective antiviral at really high intravenous doses. The problem with oral doses is you don't get to that kind of level where it's super potent like these can. It's hundreds of times more when you inject it in the blood. But we do know that it generally supports an antiviral effect, and quercetin is similar. Quercetin does have a couple of properties that help it to actually be really effective in the acute inflammatory stage. It's also one of these cytokine modulators, so it reduces TNF alpha, the interleukin 6, the NF-kappa B. So it's going to take out some of the heat. We often use quercetin as an antihistamine, actually. So it's got its role in just general upper respiratory tract and snot and all that sort of stuff. So it's helpful in that antihistamine effect, but in this case, it's doing a lot more as its high potency antioxidant at protecting the cells from being damaged. And there is a decent study on its use for correction of lung fibrosis. Yeah, and it's showing again the antioxidant effect and how it's able to do some repair work. So it'd be part of the post treatments that I expect that I'll be doing in down the line as a few soldiers wander in after their infections have left them feeling pretty weary and run down.
Do you have any thoughts about that? I mean, I'm starting to prepare myself for maybe the natural medicine's role. Will play that broader convalescence role in the end. I think, let's just reiterate that if you are listening to this and you are developing symptoms, you know where to go. You go in a hospital. All right, you know what I mean. Like
at that stage of about a week or 10 days, if you're getting worse, that's what you're doing.
We just want to play our part in the community. But I think do you have anything to comment about the potential of the role that natural medicine is going to play? I think in maybe around 9 months.
And obviously there are already people recovered. But it does look like the fatigue and post-viral problems are going to be a common outcome following this virus, and that fibrosis in the lungs, for those who were hospitalised or who were the serious cases, they're going to have some challenges to get their lungs back to good health again.
Sure. Yeah.
Look, it's still something that we're thinking about, and you and I as herbalists think of those sort of lung tropo-restorative type of tissue rebuilding kind of things. Probably not an appropriate topic for a general audience, but they're just quenching the inflammation at a deep level. We mentioned vitamin C and quercetin in that regard. I like krill oil a lot for that kind of property. It's more anti-inflammatory than fish oil. I think at that late stage we'll probably use quite a bit of quercetin, the turmeric extract, as again a kind of anti-inflammatory. I don't like the thought of using curcumin early in the infection because it's going to dampen the COX-2 kind of, activating the immune system stage. But in the chronic inflammatory stage that's set up after that type of infection, it looks to me as if it'd play a decent role in helping correct things. Then we start talking about how do you fix the mitochondria, and let's leave that for another topic. but krill oil is a pretty handy way of starting that, because it's not only got the omegas that have got that anti-inflammatory. When we're talking mitochondria, a lot of the damage is to do with that electron transfer chain that's within the inner membrane of the mitochondria. And basically, that's one of the places that viruses can damage. And so you're talking about rebuilding a membrane. And when you're rebuilding a membrane, you need phospholipids. And the beauty of krill oil is it's delivering the phospholipids and the omegas that are needed within the cell walls. It's like it's there. And so that's the beauty of krill oil over the other omega-3 products. It's delivered to the membranes, bang, like it's just exactly what it's made from.
It's fascinating. I think, look, so time to round it up. I mean, I think we've covered quite a lot of bases today, and that's actually indicative of the situation at the moment in relation to the information that people are looking for in relation to immunity. There are lots different ways to skin a cat. Now, the key ones though are probiotics, vitamin D, vitamin C, but also if you're stressed, just walk outside.
Yeah, exactly.
Turn the news on.
I mean, there's another whole thing there, isn't it? The whole kind of semi-grief thing we're going through. That's another topic. But sorry to interrupt.
No, but it's all good. I mean, as I said, I'm just I think this all swings back also to the first point that we made about the diet, right? Recovery. How do you provide good foundational measures for your body as well? And I think one of the key elements that we've seen here in both the apart but we're together type of hashtag situation that's going on around the world is that people now understand the level of personal sovereignty that's required to manage their immune system. You have to take the supplements, you have to get across some of the information, you maybe have to see a practitioner, you have to get some more information so that you can actually be part of that process of really helping all of us get through this as best we can. And thank you for being a part of that process with this episode of the podcast.
Thanks for the conversation, Phil, and enjoyed it very much. And you can see that you're stoked. You've got this big grinning fella in here with me.
Just wearing headphones makes me happy. I think it's fair to say that there'll be more episodes with us coming up. I'm thinking the mitochondria might be a next one, and maybe we'll work out how to do that really quickly. But look, we'd like to thank you so much for joining us for this episode and all the other podcast episodes. If you're new to the INL podcast, we have a special series that was recorded in Nashville, Tennessee last year with some of the leaders of natural medicine like Dan Kalish, Nancy O'Hara, and Dr. Alex Capano, who's the only PhD in cannabis, I believe, and she schooled me put me in deep water very, very quickly in relation to CBD. So if you feel like learning about CBD and also hearing me get put in deep water by a multi-degreed master, you can have a little bit of fun with that on Spotify and Apple Music. If you want to get more information about INL, please go to www.inl.asia or subscribe to our newsletter where we send out pretty much written versions of what we've just done there. Either Graeme or myself will be writing to you sporadically about some of the different things or different considerations, not just in immunity though, in all of the different ways you can unlock the potential of your natural medicine dispensary. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be back with you soon.
The INL Podcast is brought to you by Integrated Nutraceuticals Limited, Hong Kong. If you want to know more about INL, natural medicine, or how to unlock the potential of our range, simply go to www.inl.asia and sign up for our newsletter, or simply browse through our education section to see what you can find. We'll be back soon with another episode. Thanks for joining us.